Greetings, listeners in Guyana and globally. Namaste, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to another Alliance for Change on the Move Saturdays programs. Today is a very sad and happy day. Sad because we are mourning the loss of 18 girls and one boy. Sadly, that is a very trying circumstance, and our hearts are pouring with grief all over. Also, today, our Deputy General Secretary, Jaretta, she lost her sister. She was supposed to be on the program today, but she stuck with traffic, and our condolences and sympathies are with Jaretta. On 26th of May, Friday, will be 57th anniversary of Guyana's independence. And today, we'll have with us my brother from a different mother, Professor Dr. Kimani Nushi, who is a professor at the very outstanding and famous Temple University in Pennsylvania. And he also served in universities in the UK. And those of you who have not yet seen his book, I will have it up here so you can see it. It's a voluminous book in hardcover, softcover, or Kindle. A People's Political History of Guyana, 1838. Remember that date, 1838 to 1964. So he is with us today. Before I introduce him, I want to celebrate my brothers in Africa for African Day and Liberation Day. Since 1963, on Thursday, May the 25th, celebrations are occurring all over the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, UAE, and all of Africa. Today, May 25th, Thursday. Also, our Vice Chair, Kathy Hughes, had her birthday this week, and to her, our congratulations. What has happened in Mahdia is a PPP, with all due respect, abomination. For President Ali will soon have a second child. Is he not cognizant of apparent values and thinking from the heartstrings? I am saddened to see the videos on the social media. With all due respect, all the lowering of voice and humility will not fly. The president and his team and his advisors must do better. With all due respect, my intelligence is the same Al Jazeera that covers Guyana positively is right now covering Guyana negatively. So please, I hope those who are listening, our job is not to pull down. We love to point out the shortcomings, and hopefully there are solutions. In business world, I teach the SWOT analysis: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Right now, our government needs to do a SWOT analysis with people who are not of their own clique broadly, and to find out the way forward. Maybe it's also a signal from Almighty. I have heard that. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we celebrate this 57th anniversary, I had the distinct honor of being there when the British flag was lowered, and when the Union Jack was lowered, and when the golden arrowhead was raised for the first time. I know there are doubters around, so I walked with the picture of myself. This is Shamir, if you can see. If you can see me there with the last Governor General, Sir Richard Lute. He was the last Governor General, and those of you can see me, and that is on 17th of May, 1966. Remember, 17th of May, 9 days before the flag was lowered, and I was the company of Raman B. Gadraj, to whom I was personal assistant to for many years. I was in his group. So that is why it's a special joy, the lowering. I have to tell you, May the 26th, 1966 was a Thursday, the day before Jummah. I remember that very, very well. And what I can say today, if I'm asked one question, is the joy, the hope, the desire, the enthusiasm of everybody that was around then is not what is here today. It's a different energy that is going, and whatever it is, we need to find a better way forward. 1966, it was one people, one nation, one destiny. And we should ensure with the abundance of oil resources and water. Water, ladies and gentlemen, will be more expensive, more important than oil it is today. And we have an abundance of it, plus all the natural resources. So congratulations to all Guyanese, and wishing you the very best. And hopefully tomorrow, after May the 26th, will be a new day on the 58th anniversary. Today, as a business-oriented person, I have a list. I believe in outcomes and deliverables. We can have all the big presentation and spending money and signing agreement, but in the end, in the real world, it is outcomes and deliverables. And I have done my research, and for the both two top parties, I have a list of 20 items which I will share sometime during the program, both so we are all aware, and no spin doctors, no paid lobbyists can change the history. Those are irrefutable facts which we all can change. But today also, a big problem in Guyana we do not talk about, but the AFC had taken the leadership, thanks to Bernard Rollins in the diaspora, to take race as an issue, and others have taken it on, Globespan in particular, and I'm delighted, more the merrier. But in Guyana, we're at a volcanic area, and that is the president, His Excellency, went to India trying to get Indian recruits into Guyana. With a member have an employment agency to have it? Well, I tell you, that can be a volcano. Those who know India from Indian, they have a superiority race, the caste system. And we have an attorney general who, you remember, talked about his Brahmin status, the warrior status. And if that comes to Guyana with these new recruits, it will be a tinderbox that we cannot believe, will imagine. I'm sounding the alarm because I understand, I know, and I traveled and I dealt with this in Kuwait. There are over 1 million legal Indians in Kuwait and 300,000 illegal. And I was the darling among them. They call me, I was their real ambassador from India. Who knows. But because I also learn, you learn by being involved. So please, I'm sounding the alarm to the government. Be aware of this new recruitment that is planned from India. Use Caribbean, use Cuba, use Venezuela, who have been on a time of need. Reach out to CARICOM, that's in the common market. Why are we going to India? Special flights coming all the way via Brussels. Danger ahead. So ladies and gentlemen, my brother from a different mother, Professor Dr. Kibani.
Thank you very much, Brother Shamir. Good evening, good day, good morning to our viewers and listeners in different parts of the world. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to engage in this public discussion, or at least a discussion in public. I wish to join in Ambassador Professor Shamir in observing the independence of Guyana, in giving condolences to the families, friends, and other associates of the children who've been bereaved in Madia. I also want to join in observing Africa Liberation Day. It's an observation in which I've been involved for a long time. And I see these as occasions not only for celebration, if we have to celebrate, but for reflection also.
Amen.
And by this, I mean Guyana Independence and Africa Liberation Day. The tragedy in Madia must be examined, explained, and learned from, like all our major experiences. So once again, I'm grateful for this occasion, and I hope that we'll be able to begin some kind of a discussion, or at least continued discussion, on matters that are of the greatest importance to all Guyanese people.
Thank you very, very much, brother Professor Dr. K. I always call him Dr. K in our informal chat, and that just slips out. Well, what are we've had two major political parties in Guyana's 57th, and 20 outcomes, deliverables for the PNC, APNU, AFC are the national holidays for Eid al-Adha, Yawm Nabi, and Deepavali. The Feed, Clothes, and House program, announced on May the 8th by Dr. Kenneth King, an illustrious Minister of National Development. Eat what you grow, grow what you eat, to conserve foreign exchange. Number 3, Roxanne Barnum Gardens, still there, still functioning. National Park, my number 5. Demerara Harbor Bridge, deliverables, outcomes, irrespective. Number 7, CARICOM, the common market. The 3 leaders had difficulties, but they had a vision and they executed. Caribbean Common Market, now with 15 nations and many advisors. CARIFESTA, to get culture, arts. They said a nation without culture and arts will never have a good history. Well, Guyana, under the past PNC government, CARIFESTA. Non-alignment movement, jump high and jump low. South Africa liberation from apartheid. Guyana was in the 4 months. His Excellency Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. Dr. Chetty, I'm sure, was there quietly, but he was not as vocal for whatever the reason. Whether it's Apanjat or I do not know what, I cannot read his mind, but those were there. Cuban flights at Atkinson Airport. You can imagine the headache that the President Burnham would have had with Americans to allow Atkinson Airport, built by the Americans during the war days, to use as a transshipment for Cuban flight. You know, you can jump high and low. Let's just imagine what would have happened. And he stood his ground with all that was happening. The Cuban support for medical doctors and the university to Guyana, the world is known. Guyana National Service is my number 13, plus and minus. I can argue for both for hours and end. There are pluses and minuses, and leaders lead irrespective of how they are. That's why they're leader, and leaders make decision. And looking back, we can argue, yes, but that was a good, and Israel has proven that it has worked, and I say no more. If it can work with Israel and the kibbutz, we suddenly forget that they have national service is mandatory. You can complain geography and everything else, secondary. The principle is national service has worked in some countries, and it's not all that bad that some of us will tend to believe. There are downside and upsides for everything. How can we forget in the last 5 years, the ICT program by Minister Cathy Hughes, where every region, every school was to have ICT? Now, why successful programs in Guyana, when governments change, have to tear down? Isn't that waste of resources? Isn't that, I wouldn't use the description that comes to my mind, but it's very unfair to the taxpayers' monies for this tearing down. Good projects should stay on in perpetuity. That should stay on. I did the same thing in Kuwait. I didn't work only for the IPNAPNU. 3 top PPP persons. One wanted a job for me to recommend him to be the Council of United Arab Emirates in Georgetown. I was in holiday in Thanksgiving in USA. On my return, the first thing I did was spend off a strong recommendation for that PPP. So after elections, it's over. A second PPP person, when I got the 1.6 million grant from Kuwait for the road, he asked for 3 or 5 million. I went back channels to get the 3 or 5 million. But I was told, Brother Shamir, we've already passed that. Work with that and let's see. Another PPP person reached out to me for monies from Saudi Arabia for his investments. Ladies and gentlemen, these are evidence, empirical evidence, where we don't have to only be politics. And those 3 persons in the top hierarchy, they know who they are, and I have the email evidence. So this is not just blowing sackles in the air. One person even went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Guyana and gave me all kind of pressures. But I'm an ambassador for Guyana. I'm not an ambassador for a private company. So there's a clear line, and Sir Donald Jackson taught me that clear line very, very well. And so even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I did not accede to their request. I just stayed quiet because that was bordering in beyond my functional responsibility. I didn't get a manual, but common sense street marshal me says, no, I should not do for personal company aggrandizement. It has to be for national development. So these are some of the area. Successful police implementation. Minister Kemraj Ramjatan, all the British help that came was to reform the police, drawing from the Trinidadian model. What happened? Dr. Vincent Adams and EPA, he's being blamed for making a university. Well, education is pivotal. Singapore used education. Norway used education. Qatar used education. I can go on. Saudis jumping ahead with education. That is pivotal. Dr. Adams is way ahead of all the nincompoops we got around. The one who told him that he wanted to have a university. Education, training the future, management succession is imperative for leaders, servant leaders, not those who want to fill pockets and position power. So come on. Successful, good quality roads from Minister Patterson. Good quality roads. What's happening now? Yes, there's perceptions, and I have to be honest, there are 3 perceptions about Durban Park. Some will argue, I can argue too. They will argue about the pharmaceutical bond, yes. They will argue about the sugar estates, yes. But common sense, I'll tell you what I will do. Whenever I have a decision making, I always have a judicious balance of the skills, and business is included. All theories without business, that dog will not hunt. Yes, my number 20, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, asked for $10,000 from the CIA, and he got $5,000 for 2 years. That's $60,000. Ladies and gentlemen, these are some of the deliverables and outcomes for the PNC, APNU, AFC. Before the program is ended, I'll share the 20 with you and ask you to listen, and you make your own evaluation on deliverables and outcomes, not the speeches, not the signing agreement, not the first class fares and spending money. Outcomes, maximum mileage for every dollar spent. So these can all be critical evaluation and suggestions. So I will now ask my dear brother to discuss the race issue so we can have a better way forward based on what happened in the past. We can't unwrite the past. We can't unlearn the past. We should learn from the past and guide us for the present and the future. Yes, Brother Key.
Okay, we went down just now, so I'm not certain I got everything you said. We went down for a moment,
Yes.
but
Okay. All right. Well, you are now on to talk about your Guyanese society and the racial restructuring, the past, and things of that nature, and how we can use that in your research to help us going forward now and tomorrow as we begin the 50th anniversary.
all right, thanks for that. You mentioned a number of very, very glowing achievements that Guyana, in the form and shape of various individuals and initiatives, has achieved during the time we've been independent after a fashion, the 20 things. And one of the things I think we should ask ourselves is, have we really done as much as we could have done? You know, um, I think that those 20 things, and there are others we could use, that indicate that we're not dunces, we're not stupid people. We could achieve things, and in my estimation, we could achieve far more than we have achieved if the great majority of our people worked together to achieve clearly defined national goals. So I would put that out there as perhaps the major challenge facing our country, working together. And it doesn't take us any much reflection as Guyanese and even as people who are interested in Guyana to recognize that we have not worked together or as together as we should be and should have been for the longest while. And the reason for this is substantially the question of race or racial suspicions and antagonisms. And I think it's important that we recognize recent conversations in our country that have attempted to engage with the question of race. I have to be clear, honest, and put some praise in the way of the AFC because it's the AFC that initiated this recent wave of discussions about race in our country. I think the AFC has attempted to be honest. I'm not accusing anybody else of being dishonest in the recent wave, but I think one of the things that characterized the AFC's attempt or a hosting of this is my third appearance here, is an attempt to be honest, to ask questions, to get to the truth or as much as we can behind what we're talking. And I think that this is an outstanding characteristic, criterion, a value, an objective that we must have when we talk about ourselves from this point of view. So I commend the AFC, and I hope that we will continue to have these discussions, not necessarily with me alone, but or with me at all, with other people. Now, we mentioned, or you mentioned just now, the way in which the past has structured our present, and this is what I think, or at least what I think you said. And I think it's an important thing for us to understand because many Guyanese act in ways that we really do not understand. We don't know the explanation. We're not even reflective enough because we're not asked to reflect on why we do certain of the things we do, the behavior patterns we have. And a lot of this is explainable by the way in which our institutions have been structured. And it's important that we take a step back and reflect and learn what has happened to make our country what it is today. And I'm not talking about the physical features, the geography of our country. I'm talking about the geography of our minds in Guyana. So this is where I want to concentrate.
Okay.
And one of the first things that I will put forward is that race has been a central factor in the structuring of our country from colonial times to now. It may not always be overt today, but let us consider what happened when Western Europeans, first the Dutch, and later on the English, you had French for a few years in between. But substantially, it has been the Dutch and the English who have dominated our country under colonialism. And I'm going to argue that they've continued to dominate our country under neocolonialism, which is what we are at this moment. They haven't been physically present, but it doesn't mean that their influence, the way in which they structured our institutions, including our minds, has not been substantially overturned. So let's go back to the beginning. We know that indigenous people, so-called Amerindians, were the first people to occupy Guyana.
Yes.
There's some evidence that African people came to the Caribbean and the Americas way before Columbus. And I think the evidence is indisputable. What we don't know and we cannot say for certain is that those African people had any presence or substantial presence in the place we call, the geography we call Guyana today. So if we want to talk about that, we have to put it in question marks. And maybe that's the kind of thing our researchers
Yes.
will try to uncover in the future. But substantially, we know for certain that indigenous peoples established themselves in Guyana. The word Guyana means land of many waters. We have many, many geographical features, rivers and mountains and creeks and so on, named by our indigenous people. So there's a huge span of history that is occupied by indigenous people. And then Europeans descended upon Guyana. Let's be clear. This was an expansion of Western Europeans abroad. And they didn't come in peace. Many of us believe the lie that they brought Christianity to the places, that to Africa, for example, and civilization. Let's be very clear that Europeans erected a system, a vast system of criminality, banditry. They went to different parts of the world. They raped, they murdered, they stole, and they kidnapped people. The first group of people they kidnapped was the African people who they enslaved. And that's how many African people ended up in Guyana. Now, we don't need to go into the details, the horrible details of enslavement for us to understand it. I think, it's one of the things that are lacking in our attempts to understand ourselves as Guyanese people, because many of us forget or we never know about the daily rapes of men, women, and children that was practiced on the plantations. We forget that the same people who today want to lecture us about democracy and the rule of law cut off our hands and feet and, executed us because we were fighting for freedom or running away to make freedom. We forget all of these atrocities that were practiced by people who call themselves Christians and sometimes in the name of Christianity. And while I do not for one moment believe that this was a use of Christianity, I think it's an abuse of Christianity. Those of us who call ourselves Christians today should be very clear and should make very clear to each other and to the public whether or not we support these kinds of criminality that has been perpetuated in the name of that religion. We cannot remain silent about this. And there are other things that, I think that Christians need to talk about. For example, the origins of Christianity. The origin of Christianity in Africa is another important subject, because quite apart from the murder, the mass murder and the rapes and the theft of human beings, there's also theft of ideas. Europeans used and abused Christianity and other things, ideas that they got from other people. Yes. And part of the history that has imprisoned us is the way in which history itself was re-engineered on lies to make it seem as though Europeans are so superior and everybody else is inferior to them. African people in Guyana and elsewhere have been the chief sufferers of this. Many of us, people in Guyana, Africans as well as people who are not Africans, don't know the most elementary things about the history of Africa. Many Africans are scared, ashamed to say we're Africans. Many of us don't even know that we're Africans. And I'm saying that these are conditions that have resulted from the deliberate structuring of the Guyanese mind by Europeans during the time of colonialism. Our system of education did not teach us anything about ourselves, as Africans especially, but as Indians, indigenous Americans, nobody except Europeans learned anything about themselves. Fact is, Africans learned negative things about ourselves. And I'm saying that this was structured according to race.
Interesting.
If you were an African in Guyana during the time of formal enslavement before 1838, you were poor. You were enslaved, or you were hiding, running away from enslavement in one of the so-called maroon settlements. I think these were communities of resistance to European enslavement, but that's another debate. We call them maroon societies. And if you were an African, you either had to be on a plantation, enslaved, or in a maroon settlement, resisting enslavement. The vast majority of African people were on the plantations. And the plantation experience was not merely physical domination. I think it's important for us to understand that what Europeans were attempting to do was to erase African identity, disconnect African people from our history and our culture, and replace that identity with the Afro-Saxon, an African who thinks that he's a European and wants to become a European. Is not merely hideous and comical, but it's also impossible to achieve. So we have a lot of confused African people in Guyana and in other parts of the world who don't even know that they're African, who don't want to accept that they're African, who is doing the impossible of running away from being African and running towards being European. I often hear people say things like, I'm not an African, I'm not an Indian, I'm Guyanese. Well, you're conflating, you're confusing two things. You're confusing identity with nationality. And Guyanese must not be defensive in claiming whatever identity we have. If we're Indian, we should be proud to be Indian. If we're African, we should be proud to African. If we're mixed race, we should be proud to be mixed race also. Very often in these discussions, we pose questions and make answers and statements as though You either have to be Indian or African or indigenous or so on, and there's no room for mixed race people. Well, I think that it's very important that we recognize that category we call mixed race. And I think that mixed race people should teach us, or could teach us if we're careful enough, a very important lesson.
Agreed, agreed.
And that important lesson is it's okay to be different. Once your difference or your proclamation or practice of your difference does not offend your neighbor, this is a lesson Guyanese could teach the world. We often boast that we have 6 races and so on. Well, our community, Guyana, has been structured in such a fashion that race has always mattered, but in a negative way.
Hmm.
We have been so accustomed to avoiding the question of race that too many of us are on the defensive once we say race. And we've also become accustomed to try to wish away racial differences. That's natural. You have men, you have women, you have Indians, you have indigenous people, you have Africans, you have Portuguese. They're different races. Now, I am not going to tell you, and I don't believe for one moment, that racial differences are what our oppressors, our common oppressors, try to make them out to be. Let's be clear. Europeans who enslaved Africans, who put indigenous people on the periphery of society, the European society, who later on oppressed Indians and Portuguese and Chinese on the immigration, they felt superior. And they organized things to exploit these other people and to make certain, as far as they could, that other people felt inferior to them. And this is where things like the education system, the religion that most African people were subjected to, the laws of the country, all of these things were used. The state was used for that purpose. So today, many Guyanese have become accustomed to accepting an education system that malfunctions. It's inadequate. Now, this doesn't mean that tremendous progress hasn't been made since independence in bringing technical skills and so on. But I'm talking about how do we understand ourselves?
Yes.
Do we teach the history of India in our schools and our university? Do we teach the history of Africa? How do we approach studying ourselves? Do we do it? These are important questions. And we've got to recognize that a colonial or neo-colonial system, whether it's education, the economy, whatsoever, was not organized by Guyanese people in the interests of Guyanese people. Therefore, if we do not stand back and examine these systems from the points of view of Guyanese people, we will continue to inherit structures that were organized deep in our past by people who did not have our interests at heart. We have tinkered with some aspects of those systems. But I think that one of the questions we're facing is the extent to which we need to refashion these systems radically, drastically. Now, I said that neocolonialism doesn't mean that the withdrawal, the physical withdrawal of Europeans has got rid of the problem or problems imposed by Europeans. And it's there, because they have taught us to think in certain ways.
Yes.
We continue to perpetuate these modes of thought down the line, and we will continue to reproduce these harmful ways of thinking and being unless we carry out this kind of conversation and make certain that we understand what has happened in our past, the structures that we have inherited, how they function.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
one of the issues we have is the question of the economy.
Yes.
How how was the economy organized? Well, basically, this is broad strokes. African people were enslaved. African people humanized the local still plain in Guyana. Walter Rodney said, with shovel in hand. I said, humanized by hand. We dug trenches, canals, most of them, the major work to make this thing habitable. Now, let me just say something. It's not the first time that African people had done this.
Hmm.
Thousands of years ago, African people changed the course of the Nile River in Egypt
Yes.
and established a city.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't know this because it's not in the interest
Yep.
of our colonizers for us to know this.
Hmm.
Many of us still doubt that it's African people, so-called black people in Guyana, or like those in Guyana, who built the pyramids. Today there are arguments about this by some Arab people in modern-day Egypt. Arab people only went to Egypt en masse
Yes.
after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto
Yes.
him.
Yep.
It was Africans living there before.
Yes.
And we could go into a long conversation about this.
Yes.
Now,
True.
why is it that we tend not to know this? And what are the consequences of us not knowing it? What would be the consequences of us knowing these things? You see, there are lots of stereotypes that have been introduced into our minds about each other by our common oppressors. I grew up hearing about the physically weak Indian person. I remember as a small boy, Dara Singh, a great
Yes.
Indian wrestler.
Yes.
He,
Yes.
he, he went to the Essequibo Coast and I saw this big, strong Indian guy. I said, well, how could you be talking about the weak Indian? And here you have this guy. And then I started thinking, so, but these are the people who cut the cane after Africans were ejected or left the plantation. So you could call them weak. And we have these stereotypes that we steer by when we navigate each other. And it's important that we bring them forward and examine them and make certain that they're exploded. But I want to go back to African people and Indian people in the way in which race was used to structure the economy. When there was the legal termination of physical enslavement, I need to make a point here. That was not emancipation. Many African Guyanese are still not emancipated mentally from the clutches of Europeans. In the way in which Christianity is taught to us and perpetuated, we're still not emancipated. It's basically what those very vagabonds on the plantations taught us. We still teach ourselves that. There's been no radical change. Things like the curse of Ham and that kind of thing. It's a doctrine that doesn't tell us anything about ourselves as Africans. I'm not doubting that there's no need for structure in society and people to behave well and so on. But, when you look at the Bible, the 10 Commandments is the major statement of this. Well, the 10 Commandments come out of Africa. The so-called Book of the Dead, that's not the correct name, but Europeans call it the Book of the Dead. If you look at chapter 125, you see those laws there. How many of us know this? How many of us know that our ancestors had so well-organized societies that when Europeans first started going to Africa, they sent back reports saying, this is a real good place and blah, blah, blah. People didn't steal. One chap left his goods. He was ill for about 3 months with malaria, I think it was. And he was taken in and cared for. And when he came around, his belongings were still there. And he wrote, he said, these people, they didn't steal anything from me. And this is not an isolated incident. So I'm making the point that for thousands of years, African people had very well-regulated societies. I'm not telling you that there wasn't occasional theft and bad behavior. It would be foolish to believe that these things didn't occur. But what I'm saying is that you had extremely well-regulated societies. Even ill-mannered and ill-meaning Europeans said that. So how come we had these breakdowns afterwards? Well, you know what's responsible, or who is responsible, is the destruction caused by Europeans. Chinua Achebe tells us that in Things Fall Apart. You don't have to be a historian to know it. So all I'm saying is that we need to ask ourselves different questions about ourselves and the things we take as being very important. So race is important in that sense that African people in Guyana tend not to know our history. Race is important also because, as I was going to say just now, when the legal termination of physical enslavement happened, African people withdrew some of themselves from the labor force. They withdrew the aged, the infirm, people with technical skills who said that we're going to set up and make an independent life of the plantation. It's false to say that African people withdrew en masse, from the plantation. They didn't. They were far too sensible. They understood that they had to have an interdependent relationship, economic relationship with the plantation. So all of them didn't withdraw. And let me just pause to say that it's instructive that you had old people and infirm people working normally on the plantation under the regime of physical enslavement. It tells you something about the enslavers. So those people, those categories of people withdrew, but people still continued working on the plantations. The form in which most of them organized themselves was in the so-called Taz gang. And this meant that they were bargaining with their former enslavers for wages. The former enslavers didn't like that. Part of the reason they didn't like that is that because Africans were demanding something close to a just wage. Also, they didn't like the fact that people they hated. We mustn't forget that these plantation managers were racist in today's parlance. They didn't like the fact that Africans, the people they hated so much because of their race, could come and say, well, we don't want this. We want to be paid X and so on. What did they do? Well, I was taught in university in Guyana that they multiplied and divided the labor force. At the same time, with the same action, immigration. They brought Indian people into Guyana to compete with Africans in the labor force. How did this happen? Well, African people were taxed out of sight, and this is another site of oppression. Paid substantially for Indian immigration. Indian people were exploited on the plantations, and we mustn't forget this, and they were paid very, very small wages so that the plantation owners could do two things. One, they could depress the price of labor because Indian people were brought under very, very strict laws, conditions. And again, we mustn't forget this. It wasn't the same as the enslavement of African people, but these conditions were horrible. And we must be very clear about that also. So Indian people were oppressed there. They weren't paid a just wage. It means that the estate owners could keep the price of labor low and make big profits.
Yeah.
And this is what happened. Essentially, Africans and Indians were used against each other. That's one way of putting it.
Yeah.
And if we understand that both of us, both groups were exploited, I think we'll begin to recognize
Amen.
that we had then substantial interests in common, and that perhaps we still do. We need to keep that analysis going into the present, and we might see ourselves a bit differently from how we think we are now. But that story, that those differences didn't end there. One of the things that happened is that Europeans had staunchly denied African people land. Now, it's usual for us to talk about the purchase of the villages, the cooperative villages, the village movement. That was huge, glorious. But what happened? African people there bought land at inflated prices. Very soon, they had exhausted their savings. The finance system didn't cater for them.
Yeah.
And you could read how even a generation, not a generation, a decade later on, when the Portuguese were deliberately promoted to middle class status
Yes.
via the retail trade substantially, which was introduced, organized by African Guyanese, they were made to push the African Guyanese out of the retail trade. How did this happen? Well, one of the ways is that the Portuguese were given loans from the banks. Africans were not, or they were given small loans, steep repayment prices, short repayment periods, and that kind of thing. I talked about taxes before. All of those things, activities going on in villages were taxed. You had a ballahu, you had to pay tax. You had a bicycle, tax. You sell him by the roadside, tax. You had a donkey, tax. The estate had 300 mules, no tax. The estate had 600 pounds, no taxes. Now, the intergenerational consequences. Our system keeps going down, I don't know what.
That's all
The
right. That's all right.
intergenerational consequences of these structures are still with us. And still our story of unequal treatment by the colonial state is not at an end. One of the significant things that happened is that Indian people were given lands near the estates to plant rice. Now, this is not because the planters liked Indians and disliked African people. That wasn't in their calculation. They had changed their opinion of labor, and they recognize now that while they staunchly denied African Guyanese land, it was in their interest, so they thought, to give land to Indian people so that they could remain near the estates and be available to work on the estates. So that's how the differentiation came about.
Interesting.
And African Guyanese made proposals to get land over and over. No way. So you have this vulgarity where Guyana had and still has thousands of acres of land available. But because of Crown land regulations and dysregulation, African Guyanese were staunchly, consistently denied land because the estate owners wanted them to work for little and nothing on the estates. That's one of the reasons that you're going to find that after the implosion of the village movement, due to the fact that it was surrounded and attacked by the colonial state, many African Guyanese left the villages. They went to Georgetown, some of them. Others went up into the interior, gold and diamond. Later on, some would go to Wismar and Mackenzie in the bauxite industry. Now, after this period, you're going to find that there were a number of drainage and irrigation projects that were established for Indian Guyanese
Mhm.
at public expense. It means anybody who
Wow.
pays
Wow. Wow.
taxes. Yeah, we know about Brokpot, who's the Darren. There are about 9 different sites where that happened. Now, I'm not telling you it's a bad thing, but it turns out to be something not very good because that kind of state aid was given to one race group. And by this time, people are very conscious of each other and that kind of thing. So when we examine ourselves in Guyana and we want to explain the origin of wealth, relatively speaking, in the Indian community and an African community that doesn't have comparable wealth, these are only some, there are others, of the differences that we could talk about and the way in which the structuring of the economy and people's minds was done by a colonial state that had its own interest in mind, not the interest of the various groups of Guyanese. It was in their, or so they thought, in their interest to start a pot, to keep different race groups together. They actually said it. Fact is, Lawrence Storm Van Zandy introduced measures to put indigenous Guyanese and African Guyanese at loggerheads with each other. And sometimes the, the tasks that the state asks some people to perform against another group contributed to ill feelings. We could mention 2 of them. One,
Professor, yep, yep, go ahead.
one is the way in which some indigenous Amerindian, indigenous people, were used against Africans who revolted, who were in revolution, to capture runaway Africans, to spy on Africa, that kind of thing. That's one of them. Another one is the way in which many African Guyanese were recruited into the police force. And the police force, what was it? It was an instrument of colonial oppression. The police force in Guyana came into being only at the point in time when there was the legal termination of physical enslavement. And that police force was arraigned against African Guyanese. Check today the geographical location of most police stations. The oldest ones were placed on the boundaries of African Guyanese villages. That tells you something. Check it out and you're going to see.
Yeah, Prof, I got a 5 minutes alert. I've got one question on
Yep.
page 150. All the media reports, but this one is treating the media and that one is not treating the media. On page 150 in your book, you said spoke through radical press. What did you mean that happened then?
Well, I don't know which part of the radical press, which age it was in, but they were always
1880s. 1880s.
1880s.
The role of the press.
Okay, well, that is the formation of the middle class in Guyana. And one of the things that happened in the formation of that class was that there was a press that started to take on some of the excesses of the colonial state, the colonial government. And they started to criticize many of the things that they didn't like. It was still a Eurocentric press, but they criticized what they saw as excesses. And in the 1880s, you're going to get some what I call proto-parties, proto-political parties forming. And the planters enforced a lot of illegal activity to prevent people from voting. And that's one example of how the press came out and talked about this and attacked them. The press very often talked about the necessity for granting lands to African Guyanese. The press would criticize the way in which the Portuguese were being used against African Guyanese and given, and unequal treatment, a leg up. The press criticized governors who they thought were doing things that were not correct. So in that way, the press was very, very radical. However, the press conserved European values. And very often you would see, even well, that press was busy being radical in terms of what we might call the politics. They were still using terminology that was, quite frankly, racist in describing Indian Guyanese and African Guyanese. So it's radical,
Okay. All
but it's
right.
not radical in every way, and it's definitely not a revolutionary press.
Thank you very, very much. Well, equal time for the 20 PPP deliverables and outcomes. Number one, since 1950, the PPP is a Marxist party per their constitution. We are in 2023. That means the PPP in 73 years is a Marxist party. Skeldon multimillion fiasco. Amelia Falls multimillion fiasco with Flip. On LinkedIn, I saw Flip is now in the farm fresh produce. Number four, Marriott is likely to be a plus if the numbers are shown, whether we'll make a profit or we'll just cover our monies. Providence Stadium is a plus, but that was a big assistance from the government of India. Number six, Guyana in its history for the first time under the PPP government has no substantive minister of finance with the billions of oil revenue. You tell me, what is the image of Guyana? People are afraid. They've told me that is the government of Guyana's prerogative, and I hope they straighten up because it's very, very bad. They asked me why. I says maybe they're afraid of prosecution. They think the president, as the minister of finance, is exempt. But I tell him, the long arm of the law, if things are not right, they will get you. Number seven, narco trafficking. Has it returned? We're hearing now of submersibles in the rivers. Gold smuggling. Has it gold smuggling declaration gone up or down? The PS iPhone in Miami. House lots are being given out. But are they real? Are they really lots that people can build on? Are they getting the monies to make the loans, or only one person's or one group is getting the money and the rest? I've seen some houses where the steps you can't even go in. It's not even. Number 11, very poor road construction with reduce friends, families, and favorites. Why? The world is watching. Media announcements. One a day there's a media announcement. That's not deliverable. They call that Papi Show in the Caribbean. That's not real. Many conferences, few verifiable outcomes. So there must be some way that all the ministries where the billions are spending, they should start having a page on outcomes and deliverables. No ifs, ands. Wow, my biggest headache this week has been the new embassy in Qatar. Very good decision, but no substantive minister of foreign affairs. Questions are coming. 13 questions today. Where's the minister of finance? Is he sick? Foreign affairs. Is he sick? Did he resign? Is he at another conference? Tell him I haven't seen any DPI announcement. Where's your permanent secretary, the director general? I have no idea. Where was your ambassador who you appointed in October 21 from Kuwait? He was FSO 3 when I left in August 2020. October 2021, almost 14 months, moved from FSO 3 to FSO 1. Who knows? Nothing to hide. So a person with no new education, no new training, no new everything, jump to and now become number one, and you're cutting the embassy cake in Qatar, which is a signal moment in history, and he's missing in action. These are kinds of things are known and people are watching. 15, three friends, families, and favorites is continuing unabated. This one Guyana, others are saying, and I'm only echoing as an advice, one Guyana is only for the PPP party, one Guyana. The new American ambassador has been fully briefed by House Leader Jeffries and the entire Foreign Relations Committee, and she knows of what they're thinking for her to be more balanced. With all due respect, the government is not functioning when the president has to go and get things done for the citizens with his team of ambassadors. No rocket scientists. When a president has to do that, he has to ask himself what happened to his team around him. Are they trusted? Are they believable? They're not. These are all on the PPP number 17. Number 18, more propaganda, expensive propaganda from Washington, including the social media. But there's more racial conflicts. There's not less. Why there's no number 19 media conference after in Guyana's most of its history after the cabinet meeting? There is a media conference so people can know where the monies are being spent. These are the 19 of the 20 deliverables and outcomes I have, and you can check them out yourselves and balance. My number 20, the piece de resistance, for His Excellency Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, 120,000 US. When will the PPP tell us, the top 2-3 leaders or the party stalwarts, about GIMPEX? GIMPEX material and supplies by boats from East Germany, from Czechoslovakia, from Russia, from Greece, from Cuba, all the materials and the cars that came and all the contracts. When will the top leaders have the chutzpah, that's my Jewish brother's word in New York, to tell the people about that side of the PPP? Let the PPP also in its 20 years tell us why they have a non-Guyanese who is a presidential envoy, higher than an ambassador. Few do not know. But look at the picture in Qatar, the presidential person, diplomat, envoy, all manner of names, 3-4 different titles that are used in the Middle East and comes to me, and it's not in the Guyana media. But I'm just sending the alert that people are not stupid. They're watching as we go into the 28th year. There's tremendous possibility from Qatar, but they're comparing notes and talking among themselves that all is not well. And if there is find one hole, they now look for where the other holes are. So all the agreements that are signed, with all due respect from my back channels, they're going through the motion in good faith. But if we do not come up with feasibility studies and the projects are not viable, they rather give charity and zakat or grant than to go in big projects and lose money. I know of one instance in Kuwait where Kuwait walked away from $1 billion US project from one country after they signed the agreement and was working on it, and they realized that dog will not hunt, and they walked away. That is the culture which we don't seem to have mastered with all the visits from all the leaders going way back, but they have not learned the lesson because they've not stayed enough to take the sabak, the lesson. They fly in and fly out and feel it's there, but it's not. Well, Guyana, the possibility is there for us to be better for all 6 races. I encourage all to speak up, talk to your leaders, let them know how you feel, do your own research. These research are available on GIMPEX. Do a research on the web. Time. You'll see it yourself. It's nothing. I'm not making up the story. I want them to do better, to let them know we are not all fools. We are all sensible people, and we are very, very smart. Dr. Yamani, any final words from you as we close? Our time seemed to have gone way off.
Well, I think it's always important for us to meet and speak honestly and as truthfully as we could about ourselves as Guyanese people. I think we have, in tonight's conversation, contributed to that trend, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to do this or to help in this way. And I look forward for the continuation of this kind of discussion. I think it's important that Guyanese of all descriptions engage in honest reflections about ourselves. And I think that the system of education has a role to play
Yes.
in providing us with relevant information about ourselves. People are not stupid. People are going to look at the information and they are going to come to sensible conclusions most of the time. And we've got to take responsibility. This shouldn't be about blaming. Okay, if you want to blame, put blame where it needs to go. But the most important thing is for us to take responsibility to make ourselves and our country better. And to me, what this means is that everybody must have a fair chance, just about equal chance. It will never be identical in this regard, but we must have equal chances, roughly, of obtaining or developing ourselves as far as we could. All our talents and abilities taken to the highest levels possible. We will not get a system like that overnight, but we could fix that as
Yes.
one of the outcomes and begin to work towards it. One of the important foundations of such an attainment has got to be respect for each other. And that respect will only come from knowledge and understanding. And that's why what we're doing here is of fundamental importance to the future of our nation.
Amen, my brother. Thank you. Thank you very much. I also teach my students a fish stinks from the head, never the tail. So it is incumbent on His Excellency, President Ali, to show the executive leadership, not the showmanship, not to change a dress every day and hold hand. Be cognizant, be himself. Go to the masjid on Friday and salah and read the book and then practice what the book teaches, not what the spin doctors. So our 50th anniversary, hopefully this critical evaluation can be the beginning of a new dawn for our 58th. And President Ali has the potential with the oil revenues to be a most outstanding president. This is a fact, but he needs to have cooperatively everybody involved, not Abide now, we on top, no. It's everybody, including the opposition. Get them in together in one room and make decisions and come out with a united stand. It's doable. I can do it. He can do it. We can do it. There are so many leaders in Guyana can do it. The diaspora have leaders can help him, but he is the leader. He has to make the decision to be hungry for it and to do it. So we live in hope rather than die in despair, but we're crying for this leadership, this servant leadership from President Ali, forgetting all his advisors. He is the president, and his legacy will be his, none alone. Good night. Blessings with Bhagwan, Allah, Ram, Sita, Vishnu, and the African gods of peace be with you and all of us. Onward and upward, may we ever grow. Goodbye, Guyana. Good night.